Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on the evolving landscape of cryptocurrency regulation, global crypto, state of play, and regulatory priorities. So I'm Monica Sa, and I have the privilege of monitoring this fantastic session with our very expert panel. We have with us Chen, Head of Regulatory Affairs at Bullish, Tyler Williams of Galaxy, Head of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs and Regulatory Counsel. So Tyler, that's a mouthful. So lots of labels. And we have Riccardo Coassin from Clifford Chance, Italy Counsel, and then Steve Gatti, partner at Clifford Chance in the US. So all very clear experts in the field and very excited about this panel. So just a little bit of background. Obviously, 2023 was a roller coaster for the crypto industry. There was a number of significant events, including the conviction of Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX. So I think that was the nadir of the market. As we look ahead into 2024, there is renewed and interest in the sector, a lot of positivity. We've burst from the depths of the crypto winter straight into the full sun rays of the crypto summer. And alongside of that exploding price of Bitcoin, we see the first comprehensive regulatory regimes beginning to take effect in most of the financial centers, with also, we've seen the US Securities and Exchange Commission's landmark approval of 11 applications for spot Bitcoin ETF. So a huge milestone in the US regulatory space as well. And many players in the industry see this as a new era for digital assets. So today's panelists will share the insights of how they think the market is developing, what are the priorities of the global regulators, what are some of the challenges for the new regulatory frameworks. And so without further ado, let's go into the discussion. Right, so turning to our first topic, focusing on policy drivers for regulatory framework. Deng, I'm going to turn to you first. Stepping back a bit with your experience, what do you think are the high-level policy drivers for regulatory authorities in relation to the emerging crypto regulatory framework for Hong Kong, Singapore, EU?
Yeah, I think stepping back a bit, even before the collapse of FTX and the sort of increased sort of clamp down against Binance by the various regulators behind it, is that the regulators have realized that the crypto sort of as a financial services industry and is now too big to ignore, and it is now becoming really an essential part of the overall financial services market infrastructure. So, and it is entrenched not just in trading, but also to some extent in the use of crypto as part of the payment services system. So I think that overall has made those regulators realize that it is time to bring it in. And I think obviously the approaches in those jurisdictions have been different. So we saw Singapore having embraced crypto quite, I guess, 2 or 3 years earlier than Hong Kong, but they simply regulated the industry out of their payment services regime. And then realized that focusing just on AML and cybersecurity is insufficient to provide the overall investor protection. So Hong Kong kind of waited their bit before they made the regulatory regime mandatory, and that's only becoming effective sort of last year, from June of last year. But that framework had been in the works for over 2 years. But then the Hong Kong approach had been fairly different, which is essentially leveraging off their existing securities framework to regulate crypto, but focusing only for the time being on exchanges. Whereas I think UA is probably taken the most comprehensive approach compared to all of the jurisdictions we've seen, having worked on a comprehensive regulatory regime that regulated all aspects of the business. and payment services. So so in addition to simply regulating the industry as payment services, they're regulating trading, dealing, custody, and also trading venue. So, and from a policy perspective in those countries, it's very much the approach of one, encouraging the industry as part of the overall sort of fintech policy to bring in businesses into their respective regime. But Singapore, unfortunately, I would say, have gone backwards a little bit with the collapse of FTX, so they are taking a lot more conservative approach when it comes to inviting new players. But whereas Hong Kong and the EU remains quite encouraging towards the sector.
Tyler, I'd like to bring you in on the conversation here. I mean, how do you think your journey in with the US regulatory landscape compares with what Ding has just described in Singapore, Hong Kong, and EU?
I would say it's very similar, just leaning more conservative. And what I mean by that is I think how regulators think about it in the US is that if we mark 2022 by the blowups in the industry, the FTX, Celsius, 3 hours, et cetera, 2023 was colored by the, I would call, regulatory clampdown and lawsuits from the market regulators, and even sort of the squeeze or the pressure being put on the digital asset economy in the US from non-crypto primary regulators, i.e. the banking regulators and the custody regulators, et cetera. Then we have 2024 where we've seen the ETFs launched in the US, and that was primarily born out of lawsuits. And it's funny to think that we've come almost 10 years from the first lawsuit relative to a spot Bitcoin ETF. So I would say it's more conservative than what Ding articulated. And there's still this desire in the US to have a walled garden approach to crypto regulation in the US. And what I mean by that is prudential regulators, whether they're banking or insurance in the United States, they like to think about how do we safeguard risk from our primary regulated institution. And there's still this mentality that they're going to keep crypto out of the regulatory ecosystem. So I would say that's the overhanging divide between the US and other jurisdictions. And then the last thing I would say is that if you think of Europe and Hong Kong, et cetera, as having a regulatory approach of creating a bespoke system to account for crypto, the US is still in this approach where we have existing laws and rules that we can fit the ecosystem into. What we're missing here is the actual rules and telling people how to do that. So we're saying, come in, we have a system that works, but we're not telling the people who want to do that how the system works for them.
I mean, given that they had to, the SEC had to capitulate to allowing the Bitcoin ETNs, is it realistic for them to think that they can keep crypto out of the regulated space?
I think they can do it to a limited extent. So I think if what we can take away from the 11 spot ETFs that were approved in the US is that if you look at the mechanics behind them, they are cash create and redeem. And what that means is that banks and broker dealers are not able to hold the underlying assets on their balance sheet. And there's many different reasons that need to be addressed to allow banks and broker dealers to participate. And we need to solve things like how we allow broker dealers and the SIPC, the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, which is basically an insurance fund for broker dealers, how we account for customer losses within SIPC relative to broker dealers who are touching crypto. We haven't done that. That's like a technical thing that needs to be addressed. We haven't addressed how the regulatory capital rules for banks that want to custody digital assets on their balance sheet. And there's issues that are relative to that from the SEC with regard to the staff accounting bulletin that I'm sure most in the call are familiar with. So there's technical things that we need to address to move the dial more into the world of allowing regulated institutions that are not crypto only to participate in a more fulsome endeavor in the US.
Yep. Steve, I'm going to bring you in on this. What are your thoughts?
Well, to echo what Tyler said, it's, if you think about just starting with the excitement around the Bitcoin ETFs, well, that was, as he said, almost 10 years in the making, kind of kicking and screaming through litigation and a 3-2 decision with a statement by the chair that I think illustrated his true views on the approval. We have coming down the pike will be the applications for a Ethereum ETF and how that moves forward. But as importantly, there is major litigation underway in the U.S. involving Coinbase, Binance, Kraken that have really kind of briefed and put forward the most important issue, the threshold issue in the US that will drive how the industry is ultimately regulated, which is the status and classification of digital assets. And this kind of ongoing, say, 50-year turf war between the SEC and the CFTC, and where those assets fall and how that litigation works out. We're still in a period in the US, unfortunately, of regulation by enforcement and even evolution of the industry by enforcement. So, I'm not terribly optimistic that there will be a kind of unifying, understood, clear regulatory framework within the existing framework, or a new framework through legislative or regulatory development around these assets in 2024.
I think this might be a good segue into the next topic, which is about increasing regulatory alignment. And while, I mean, what I'm getting from Steve and Tyler is that it's regulatory alignment potentially outside of the US, so ex-US, because the US is not going to necessarily align with the rest of the world in terms of approaching the regulation of crypto. Maybe bringing in Riccardo, clearly the EU is taking a comprehensive approach to its regulatory framework. Can you give us some thoughts about what are the thinking behind that, and also how do you think that will sort of push the rest of the jurisdictions along in thinking the same way?
Yeah, I think, following on what Ding and Tyler and Steve said, I think the consensus is that regulators are still somewhat uneasy when facing this phenomenon, even those that are more say, proactive and willing to regulate. So I think the EU shows that, shows an acknowledgement that I think it's fair to say, I don't want to jinx it, but we can say crypto is here to stay. And I think the EU comprehensive framework shows that the EU regulator has been willing to acknowledge that. The crypto ecosystem has recovered, and not just in terms of price level, which is in front of us, but also in terms of credibility. And the EU framework is one of the factors that contributes to credibility. And so I'd say the ecosystem is now mature enough and resilient enough that it deserves to get to the next step, also in terms of regulatory acknowledgement. So, despite the uneasiness of a regulator, I feel not doing anything is not an option. And at some point, the time will come for everyone to face the music. And just turning the head the other way or banning everything is not going to work when the social and economic phenomenon which is behind crypto is so strong that at some point everyone will have to act. Then in terms of how to regulate, EU may be an example, and I mean, it's interesting that EU is among the pioneers. And maybe there's a benefit in not coming first in terms of being able to observe how things will play out in the EU, what works well, what does not work as well. So maybe that can be used to calibrate the framework. But again, something at some point will need to be done, I would say, in all the key jurisdictions.
Ding, this sort of follows your sort of description of where the different jurisdictions, Asia Pac and are, Singapore and Hong Kong. Do you think, you mentioned Hong Kong is leveraging off the securities framework, but only focused on exchanges at the moment. Singapore is really focused on payments and the structures payments. Do you think Hong Kong and Singapore are going to move towards a more comprehensive crypto regime, and what would be the timing of all this?
Sure. I think the short answer is probably yes. I just a little bit more background on the Hong Kong framework. So the law itself is broad enough to essentially capture all aspects of crypto asset service providers. But because the SFC has done this approach, which is simply leveraging of the existing security standards and plus, the additional regulations applicable to crypto assets, which essentially relates to custody and certain aspects of trading venue. So what their focus is on simply regulating custody and trading venues out of the more bespoke VATP framework, but regulating dealing in virtual assets through the licensed, its existing licensed broker-dealer regime. So it's not ideal, it's somewhat, unnecessarily complicated. Singapore is moving towards, so they're changing its rules now. So they are really looking at bringing in a much more comprehensive framework, actually borrowing quite heavily from the Hong Kong regime, but with a Singaporean twist, which is somewhat less flexible, I would say. But they are also going to, is turn that payment services regulatory licensing regime into a more full investor protection regime that includes regulations on custody, on market integrity, conflict of interest management, leveraging of some of the more sort of traditional, leveraging of the regulatory standards you would see in the sort of traditional securities regime. However, so that's about the only alignment I could see, also compared to EU and UK, etc. So each regulator is really borrowing from, not borrowing, but almost mirroring what already exists in the regulatory framework for securities and futures. And then essentially add on additional regulatory requirements, which they think are specific to crypto, particularly around the area of custody of customer assets. I would say to some extent, those standards are even more stringent than that, than those applicable to the securities firms. But beyond that, each regulator is very much insisting on regulating, the firms locally. So there's a kind of an unwillingness beyond, outside of the EU, there's really an unwillingness to get into any kind of mutual recognition type agreements for crypto firms, particularly with respect to custodies, very much localized. Regulators want to see the customers in that jurisdiction having their assets custodied by a locally regulated custodian with at least majority of the keys onshore, and not, so that kind of almost a lack of trust of another regulatory regime outside of their own.
I mean, I think the crypto custody point is quite interesting because, when you look at the crypto custodians, the big ones are based in the US. So looking at a crypto custody, Tyler, what is some of the challenges of being a crypto custodian in the US?
I think the primary challenge is that in the U.S., from a custody perspective, we relied on the National Banking Act to do so, and we have one crypto entity that has a license from a U.S. regulatory institution at a national level to provide those services. So if you think about trust services and custody services in that regulatory ecosystem in the United States, we have a dual regulatory system. We have a state and federal approach to that. And there's only one entity that has a national charter to provide those custody services. But then I think the underlying regulatory approach to that is that if you look at the ETFs, and I'll just go back because it's a real live example to that. If you look at the ETFs, the custody arrangements that are for those ETFs, only one is what I would call a traditional financial institution. So we have not been progressive in the U.S. in terms of our licensing departments of providing strict rules of the road of how we safeguard customer assets from a custody regime and a trust service perspective from our regulators. And I think it's been a little bit of A, understanding the technology, and B, understanding precisely how they can arrange for the safeguarding of those assets within the traditional regulatory regime. In my opinion, that story changes when we have a U.S. regulatory system at a federal level for fiat-backed stablecoins. So I think once we decide what's going to be the underlying collateral to back a well-regulated fiat-backed stablecoin product, that activity from an issuing perspective and from a custody perspective will likely end up living in a banking institution or in a regulatory system that is regulated by the Office of the Comptroller of Currency.
I mean, and do you think that's going to be likely in 2024?
I think it's tough, but there's a chance. So I think the two ways that in which we're going to get progressive policy in the U.S. is through the courts or through Congress. And the courts are sort of an open question. In Congress, if you look at the general dynamics in the House and the Senate, the House has for sure been more progressive in their activity on these issues. They've passed stablecoin legislation out of the Financial Services Committee. They've passed market structure legislation, i.e., how we treat digital asset securities and commodities. And they've done that through the House Financial Services Committee and the Agriculture Committees. And I think there's a strong desire for them to do something this Congress. I just think the macro environment for legislating in the U.S. is pretty now. We have huge things that are not relative to crypto that we have to tackle from a spending and a spending environment in the U.S. and funding the government. And I think if you look at the congressional calendar in earnest, because this is a political season and we have elections, there's really only 6 weeks of actual time between now and the end of the year that they can actually legislate in the House and the Senate. So it's just tough to get something done. But I would say there's a slight chance, maybe a 10 to 15% chance at the top end.
Yeah. Steve, any thoughts?
Well, returning kind of to the custody point, this is a great illustration of where things are in the U.S. If you go to securities custody, and there's a regime that was put in place, time has a time limit on it, only has about 2 years left, called a special purpose broker dealer. And this was a design, essentially, if you could set up a new broker dealer and kind of cabined off all other activity except custody in digital asset securities, you could be approved by the SEC and FINRA and provide that service. Well, there's only been one approval to date. And interestingly, the company that has been approved recently announced that the first asset that they're going to custody is Ethereum. So to be a special purpose broker dealer, your activities have to be limited exclusively to digital asset securities. So therefore, it was a statement, I guess, of sense that Ethereum is a security, which garnered a immediate reaction by the chair of the CFTC that Ethereum is a commodity. So either this new special purpose broker dealer is acting outside of its charter because Ethereum is not a security, or it is a security, and we have the two main market regulators in the U.S. Continuing to be at odds with that. So it's a good example of why this issue of classification needs to be resolved before we can kind of move to more comprehensive framework around the regulation of these assets.
I think it's a good point now to sort of become a little bit more granular. We've talked about sort of the broad frameworks of regulatory regimes and which direction they may be going in different countries. Let's go into more about the compliance challenges of the different regulatory regimes. I think the US, is quite complicated. We talked about crypto as an example. We'll come back to Bitcoin in this Bitcoin ETFs in a second. But Riccardo, let's focus on EU for now, pre and post MiCA. What are the key challenges for a digital asset firm operating in the EU in order to comply with the new requirements?
Yeah, so before MiCA, clearly the issue, the main challenge was, and actually still is, at least for a few more months, that there are as many frameworks within the EU as there are jurisdictions, and they are not harmonized and possibly conflicting. So to do business across Europe, one has to monitor requirements in all the EU jurisdictions, and there is no form of passporting. And this is, of course, going to change with MiCA, because then there will be licensing in one jurisdiction and then passporting all across the EU. But the flip side is that MiCA will bring in a very heavy-handed regulation for crypto asset service providers, because the MiCA will closely mirror the existing regulation for the financial sector. So basically, the regime for crypto asset service providers is essentially borrowed from MiFID. Then there's a market abuse section, which is basically borrowed from the market abuse regulation and so forth. And this is not surprising because regulators tend to work with, they already know, as Dean mentioned also before. So even without going as far as to say that everything is a security, then the approach is still to maintain that the crypto ecosystem looks and behave in a manner which is close enough to the traditional financial system that it should follow more or less the same rules, the same risk, same rules principle. So what it means is maybe that in the head of the regulator, firms should behave in the same way as traditional financial firms, but this approach does not always sit well with the specificities of crypto. Maybe our panelists will have practical examples of how this doesn't always work perfectly, but generally speaking, the implication is that firms that in many cases were not even regulated at all before will now be suddenly attracted to very strict regulation that they may not be used to, and possibly doesn't work very well with how their business is structured and organized, and they will have to rethink and possibly rebuild their setup to meet the challenge.
I mean, I think that would be a good segue to you. What do you think from a firm perspective would be the main sort of challenges to uplift your compliance and policies for MiCA?
Sure. I think it really depends on where your home jurisdiction is within the EU. Because prior to MiCA, various countries within the EU had their own sort of national regulatory regime for crypto, most of which, if they had one, was only an AML registration. Whereas we all know, as Riccardo rightly pointed out, that MiCA is almost, it mirrors closely the existing financial services regime, which is MiFID. And that is a full investor protection, framework with about gazillion, additional regulatory technical standards published underneath it. It is a very complex regulatory framework. So I would say for a firm that is only operating under an AML registration, the uplift to MiCA will be extremely, it will be very difficult. I wouldn't say extremely difficult, but very, very difficult. Particularly bearing in mind that there are still tons of regulatory technical standards yet to be published. And there are a lot of when it comes to operational specifics, and the MiCA, there are a lot of unknowns. For example, would there be like a mirror image of the, post-trade transparency reporting requirements that exist under MiFIR? Would that be replicated for MiCA to enable the EU regulators to do their own market surveillance to ensure a fair and efficient market in the trading of crypto assets? That in itself is a huge compliance uplift. So even things like how do you deal for essentially leaving aside issuers of crypto assets having to become, register themselves, particularly for issuers of stable coins, as we all know, there's that quite a significant uplift. But what about firms which are currently offering a number of assets which are not approved by any of the EU regulators? Like how can they, continue to offer those assets to customers in the EU and be compliant with MiCA? So that's quite a lot of unknowns in that area. And the other thing to mention is, right, as I said before, a lot of national regimes chose AML registration. And I would say that with the exception of France and Germany. So France and Germany, have all, since they started regulating the sector, have basically leveraged off the MiFID framework. So I think firms which are, but obviously France had the complication of there's a difference between the full licensing regime versus the simplified regime. The full regime is basically a replica of MiCA. So if you're a firm that has the full license, then you're fine. And then I think today there's only one firm that's got the license, which is SG Forge. In Germany, like if you're already licensed by BaFin with the trading licenses and also the crypto custody licenses, your MiCA uplift will be very straightforward. And of course, if you're a MiFID II investment firm that's already licensed in the EU, you can simply top up to the equivalent permission under MiCA pursuant to Article 60 of MiCA. So actually, the transition to MiCA for existing EU licensed investment firms are going to be much more straightforward than, say, a crypto firm that is simply operating on an either unregulated or a AML registration only basis.
Monica, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, my fault. So you make a really good point that it all depends on where you're located, depending right now to see how much of an uplift you need to put into place with MiCA. And again, I think another good point is we really don't know what the content of the MiCA regime is until we get the full RTSs on board. So it's a chicken and egg, but I think it's the same thing that you always experience when you have reg change in the EU. You need to move with the changes and as RTSs are published. Tyler, we started off, you mentioned already the ETFs, the Bitcoin ETFs, and some of the challenges, and you mentioned the SEC requiring ETFs to only create and redeem with cash and not in species. Were there any other focuses of the regulator with SEC on improving the spot Bitcoin ETFs?
I think there was a lot of issues surrounding. Like, obviously, it took them a long time to get to the progressive posture that led to the outcome. I think the issues that the SEC is dealing with on a macro basis, whether it's the broker rules, the exchange definition, they have outstanding rule proposals that have yet to go to finalization. There's issues within that. The authorized participants and the role of custodians within the ETFs. I think there are issues that I briefly touched on before that are relative to future ETFs, whether they're ETH or anything else. Particularly how the special purpose broker dealers and how the broker dealer system in the US, how they touch custody. And if you think about the traditional equities markets, like we use broker dealers for the vast majority of the custody arrangements that we have for securities. So there are technical issues that need to be addressed within that if we ever want to get to a perspective saying these broker dealers or special purpose broker dealers can touch the underlying asset. Outside of that, I think there are issues that are at play that could change the direction of the commission and the market regulators. In particular, the staff accounting bulletin that I briefly touched on before. What it basically says at a high level is that if you are a public company that has to comport with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board rules, which is an underlying body that lives under the jurisdiction of the SEC, that if you're going to custody digital assets, you have to treat them as on-balance sheet liabilities. And what that does in the custody environment in the US is it has a particularly punitive regulatory capital impact on the traditional custodians in the ecosystem. So the large banks that participate as custodians in the United States, it keeps them largely out of the digital asset custody business. And I think that those are things that are open items for the regulator. At present, the staff accounting bulletin, it lives as guidance, non-binding guidance from the SEC. There is an effort underfoot in Congress to use what's the Congressional Review Act to rescind this and rescind this in its elevation to a formal rule from the commission. So I think those are the areas that I see as outstanding, and then of course the ongoing lawsuits that are already underway. It's the broker rule, the exchange definition, the staff accounting bulletin, and then these lawsuits. Those are the four areas that I see as sort of other main focuses for the commission and for the market regulators.
Steve, anything to add?
No, I think Tyler summarized that quite well, and I think part of the issue that we see in the U.S. was kind of encapsulated quite well in a recent dissent by Commissioners Peirce and Ueda, where in the shapeshift litigation, which I would encourage everyone to take a look at, where they went through a hypothetical conversation between someone like most in the industry trying to do the right thing and the SEC around, okay, I want to register. You say I should register, but how do I do that? And what is a security? What is not? How do I register that security? What information do I provide about it? Where can I trade it? And they go through this wonderful kind of simplistic Q&A that demonstrates what the issues are in terms of getting from point A to point B, and hopefully through some of the proposed rulemaking, some of the litigation being resolved, maybe a thaw of sorts at least at the SEC, and we can see some movement.
Great. Moving on to what you guys think, whether regulators are ready or not. So the readiness of regulators, or to the entire panel, do you think regulators are up to the challenge of regulating this industry? And I'm going to start with you, Steve, just to continue on what you just said about the SEC.
Sure. I mean, look, in terms of the intellectual and breadth of knowledge, absolutely. I think regulators are very much up to the task, and we deal with folks at the Commission and other governmental authorities all the time, and I think in many cases the issues are considered in good faith and with an understanding of the technology. There are specific, and kind of new features to these assets that need to be understood, and then to the extent it can fit within an existing regulatory framework, or as Tyler pointed out, how that existing regulatory framework needs to be modified or adjusted to deal with the features of these assets and these markets. But I think we've also seen in proposed legislation frameworks coming out of Congress that are thoughtful and can serve, whether it's with respect to digital assets totally, or stable coins, that can serve as a kind of model or a beginning point if there was engagement around the process, as opposed to, and I hate to be cynical, but a use of the enforcement power in order to set the ground rules or create a chilling effect around innovation. One area where I would hope to see in 2024 some development is the use and introduction of blockchain and DLT technologies into the operational mechanics of the markets, and where there are where the value of this technology can be recognized. This is independent of say digital assets per se, but use in securities clearance, settlement, transfer agency, payments, any number of applications that I think if we were not under, say, this broader cloud of crypto, should get a better reception with the regulators, but to date really have not.
Ding, what do you think? Are regulators ready?
I think generally, yes. Particularly the ones that in France, Germany, in the UK, in Hong Kong, Singapore to a varying extent, I would say. But generally, I think the EU regulators are quite well prepared, because they have spent a lot of time trying to understand the industry. And whereas I think there is obviously that degree of still a degree of fear almost, or generally through a lack of understanding of the technology. Sometimes I think there's still a little bit of lack of a misconception about the risk associated with the industry and how the technology works. I think the challenge from the regulators, and I think they do need to work on this, is to understand the different business applications of the blockchain technology. There's a very, and the various business models of the potential licensee firms, because there's quite a big difference between a payment services provider, that facilitates just, payments and providing wallet services, versus an exchange that is operating a trading venue, versus a pure custodian, versus a broker dealer. Like, these are very just as they are in the traditional financial services space. These kind of businesses are very, very different operating processes. And so whilst just generally the regulators are prepared, I do feel that there's still a real lack of understanding of how it works. To sometimes in the conversations, I do still feel there's that homogeneous idea that somehow, like trading crypto is instantaneous, that, it's not. So there's also like a mixture, like a huge mix between, or confusion almost, between the payment service provider versus a trading venue. These are very different operating models, but there doesn't seem to be that degree of understanding. But whereas if you give them the difference between, let's just say, a PayPal versus a, like a stock exchange, right? The regulators instantly understand the difference. But with when it comes to crypto, they don't seem to readily appreciate the differences. And that, I think, is quite important when it comes to applying the right regulatory approach, right? Particularly using a risk-based approach. And like, kind of, even though theoretically, they agree like we should use a risk-based approach, but in terms of application, we're not, I think the industry is not seeing enough the right application from the regulators in applying the right approach with, in terms of what is the actual risk for the industry, or the perceived risks.
Riccardo, do you agree that the EU regulators, I mean, each individual country, but also the EU as a whole, do you think they are ready and able to regulate the sector?
Well, yes, I would echo the other panelists, and also agree that there may be differences within the EU in terms of approach and also skill level. And there's definitely a learning curve when dealing with this environment, which is completely new and didn't exist like 15 years ago, and is so dependent on technology. But I also see my experience that regulators are becoming more skilled. They are developing their expertise. Their objections are becoming more sophisticated, and they're also expanding their staff with more tech people to be able to handle the issues. So I do see there's a genuine attempt to regulate this in good faith, and also investing in the resources that are needed. And I mean, hopefully, the more tech people fill the ranks of the regulator, the less hostile the attitude of the regulator should be, because you have people that understand the underlying technology, and they are able to identify the actual threats, but also dismiss the perceived risks that are not actual risks. So, but I mean, all in all, speaking for Europe, I would say, because I mean, as lawyers, we always tend to focus on what's not working properly and what could have been done better. But I have to say that having to regulate this phenomenon for the first time, I would say a good job has been done so far in Europe of coming up with a comprehensive framework. So I would say the regulator has, I mean, despite all that can be improved, they did a fairly good job so far.
Great. I'm going to change tact a bit and go back towards more sort of international cooperation again. But I think I'm going to turn to Tyler on this, because it is sort of focusing on what we've talked about already, but more specific. So how do you believe the global regulatory landscape and law enforcement in particular, and I guess from a US perspective more relevant, will adopt to accommodate the borderless blockchain technology in finance, including decentralized finance platforms like DeFi platforms, etc. It's sort of related to what we've already talked about, but I mean, in the US, is there a clarity of action for dealing with the global regulatory frameworks?
A real tough question in transition. I would say short answer, it already works to some extent right now, and we've seen evidence of that in settlements, particularly the recent settlement between the Department of Justice in the US and Binance. So we've seen evidence of it already working. In interdicting AML, money laundering violations, we've seen evidence that companies in the digital asset economy, whether or not they retain or have money service businesses and registrants with the Department of Treasury through FinCEN, or money transmission licenses in a state basis, we've seen evidence of it working. What I think is an open question in the US and internationally as well is the level of additional granularity from a law enforcement perspective that we need on networks, nodes, validators, and miners. And I think that's an open political question. And how I would describe it is, on one end of the spectrum, we have policymakers and legislators who believe that the best case of interdicting bad action is through centralized intermediaries. So banks, broker-dealers, exchanges, people who hold those money transmission licenses and are registered as money services businesses, that we should put the obligation on them to ensure that the on and off ramps, so to speak, where money comes in is transposed either in fiat or in crypto, that those are the safeguarding our system of finance. Then there are, on the other end of the spectrum, there are those who are saying that the technological intermediaries, so the nodes and the validators and miners, that they too should have obligations that are placed on them. I think if you believe that's right, we have to get to a belief system that we're going to require open source software to KYC unknown entities. And I think that's practically infeasible from a law enforcement perspective. Like, it's very difficult to imagine that law enforcement is going to go into an individual's home that is running a miner and arrest that computer or say that they have done bad actions. It's just hard to believe that that is going to be a reality. And I think that's the other end of the spectrum. And there's a political debate happening about what type of rules that we want to force upon the industry. And what I don't have a great answer to, and I'd look to some of my other colleagues, is how much that international cooperation is happening between U.S. law enforcement, U.S. regulatory bodies, and the international community.
Jing, what do you think? Is there any response to Tyler's question? Do you think there's any cooperation between law enforcement with the U.S. authorities and internationally?
I'm not, to be honest, I'm not aware of any case examples, but just borrowing from past experiences in sort of the traditional financial services industry, there definitely is, right, between the regulators, particularly the major regulators in like Hong Kong, Singapore, and the United States. They always have a very close working relationship. Similarly for the major EU regulators, particularly in the areas of enforcement. And I don't see why they wouldn't, because a lot of these regulators already have MOUs in place. So that's with the United States. So that would include the FCA in the UK, BaFin in Germany, MF in France, etc. I don't see why they, if when it comes to something going wrong, particularly around the areas of financial crime, I don't see why they wouldn't be cooperating, either by entering into an additional MOU or trying to leverage off the existing MOUs in place.
Steve, your thoughts being a litigator?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen over the years with the really broad extraterritorial effect of U.S. law across any number of areas, and even beyond financial regulation in terms of sanctions and OFAC, AML requirements, FCPA, but also within traditional markets and including crypto, and as Tyler pointed out, in terms of the Binance and other scenarios. And I don't see that discontinuing, particularly where there has been a desire to avoid the U.S. on one end by the industry, but on the other end, it's the largest market and deepest market in the world, and it's hard to avoid. So I don't see there being a slowdown in that, at least cooperation around enforcement and prosecution. Where I haven't seen as much is you have organizations like IOSCO and other kind of multilateral policy and associations trying to bring together global solutions. I haven't seen that as much in crypto as we see in more traditional markets.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, we're coming up to the hour, so I've got one last panel question to everybody. So what are your predictions for the most significant regulatory developments in 2024, and how can businesses best position themselves to respond? So I'm going to start with Riccardo.
In terms of the EU, we have indications as to what is still to be done, what's not covered in MiCA or what's just partially covered. So we know that there are things that are in the radar, such as regulation of DeFi, which is only partially captured, or NFTs, although maybe that's not as a popular an argument as it used to be. So this kind of things. I wonder, I mean, there's a lingering question about energy consumption, which was a big topic, but I don't see it being brought about as frequently in recent times. But I mean, that's potentially still relevant, so we'll see about that as well.
Great. Ding?
Yes, a couple of things. I think on the EU side, I quite like to see additional clarity from ESMA on the on how they want to regulate crypto settled derivatives, whether that should go under the existing, MiFID, MiFIR framework, or would they want to, regulate that under MiCA? So that's the sort of what I want to see. But I think the big item is the UK. We're all sort of anticipating the UK sort of crypto regulatory regime becoming somewhat in place, or at least to try and to get some clarity on that sometimes this year. So just waiting for that, waiting with excitement, shall we say?
Yeah. I think we all are waiting for excitement on that, with excitement on that. Steve, first, and then finally, I'm going to give Tyler the final word. So, Steve?
Sure. I think if we have an increased kind of institutional adoption, or the forces, based on the performance of these assets, and a greater kind of integration that we've seen, like through the Bitcoin ETF, and kind of further penetration, I think that will continue through 2024. And then the judicial area, and whether we have some significant developments in the exchange litigations, and whether that also puts increasing pressure on U.S. regulators to act.
And lastly, Tyler, thanks, Steve. Lastly, Tyler.
I'll take it a slightly different direction because Steve stole what I was going to say. One quick point on what Steve said. I'll give a shout out to Galaxy's research team. We wrote a great paper called the Great Wealth Transference Impact on Crypto. That's specifically relevant to the ETF debate and the institutional adoption that we believe will happen. But I would say on your specific question, I think it's two things. I think it's the lawsuits that are overhanging the market regulators, and then the second thing that I think impacts the people and the policy positions and the direction of Congress are the elections in the U.S. Like it has a big impact on the people in place at regulators, has an impact on their desire and motivation to be progressive in an area. And I think there's two directions in the U.S. There's one direction that says we can fit this within the existing system. And if that's true, then you need people who want to do that and want to do the work to get it to that point. And if it's not that, then it's going to be in the legislating bucket, which I would put where the EU is, where we've had a progressive policy stance to push the market regulators into a position of accomplishing goals.
Okay, so thank you very much, panelists. We've covered a huge amount of information and issues, and thanks very much for your insights. Very informative. To the audience, don't miss our next session today. It's at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time or Daylight Time. We've got 3 o'clock GMT, 4 o'clock CET, and unfortunately for APAC, 11 p.m. Hong Kong time for our next session. The next session is covering the new era of partner banking, pitfalls and challenges for fintechs in 2024, led by our US colleagues Young Kim and Vipul Nishawala. There's also, please do look at our program for the next sessions for the next 2 days. There's some really great panel sessions. But with that, I'm going to sign off, and apologies for being a few minutes past the hour. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.